Good afternoon and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. I'm Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. Before we get to our speaker, Dakota Wood, let me introduce the JPC and our work. We were established in 1985 to provide perspectives and analysis of foreign and domestic policy by scholars, academics, and commentators. You can find us at our website, www.jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can read our insight articles, our magazine inFOCUS Quarterly. By the way, our guest today, Dakota Wood, has been a contributor to inFOCUS magazine and an excellent one. Our blog In Context, or you can read our Alliance Tracker and Frontline Defense blogs. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, and free speech and intellectual diversity. That last one is hot on our list these days. This series of calls began in the early stages of the Wuhan virus. I know that's politically incorrect. I generally call it the Communist Chinese government virus. We began to focus on the non-medical implications of the pandemic. But it seems like every time we go subject hunting, we get back to China. We have done China's responses to the virus, China in Hong Kong, China in the Middle East, China as a security issue between the United States and Israel, and more. We have, as you know, also done Iran, Israel, and last week, the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and took a side trip to the United States Supreme Court. But we generally come back to China somehow. It's been clear that the American public's view of China has changed over the past 8 months, catching up perhaps to the security concerns expressed by the Pentagon and by the White House, even before the virus. So what are we doing about what we know? What are we doing about the threats that are out there, but may have receded in the public eye, being as we are hyper-focused on the pandemic, the election, and the Dodgers being down 3-0 to the Braves? That's where today's guest comes in. We're going to learn more about the U.S. defense budget and defense priorities, how the money is spent, where the money ought to be spent. Dakota Wood, our guest, wrote recently, "Without security, none of the other things we want to accomplish at home or abroad are possible." So before we begin, remember that you are muted. You can send questions during the presentation using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. No emails to info@jewishpolicycenter.org today, please, just the Q&A function. So let me introduce Dakota Wood. Dakota Wood served in the United States Marine Corps, retiring in 2005 as a lieutenant colonel. He is the Senior Research Fellow for Defense Programs at the Heritage Foundation, where his work is focused on how and how well the services and DoD ensure that the United States can preserve and protect and promote our critical national security interests. He originated and serves as the editor for Heritage's Index of U.S. Military Strength, the only annual assessment available to the public on the status of America's military and its ability to carry out its core functions. And I will tell you, as a layperson, this is a document worth looking at. If you have an interest in how we do what we do, this is something you should poke at. After retiring from the Marine Corps, and before Heritage was lucky enough to get him, Dakota was Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, where he worked on war games and authored papers on topics that included conventional operations against a nuclear-armed adversary. That one scares me. The U.S. response options to the imminent failure of a large state, China, Russia, irregular warfare, the proliferation of advanced technologies and weapons, evolving security challenges within the Western Hemisphere, and the development of what are called transformation strategies, which I'm going to ask him about later. There is no one better, I think, to talk about defense and defense spending, what to do and how to do it, than Dakota Wood. And so it is my pleasure and my privilege, Dakota, to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much. Get my words out for having me on and engaging with your audience. the topic that you raised, and we're going to talk about defense budgeting. Why would you spend $1 on anything if you didn't think it was important, right? But I think lost in a lot of the political debate here in the United States over defense spending and capabilities really has to do with scale. It's been a while since we engage in any kind of a major conflict or a sustained competition with a very capable partner or opponent rather. And so we lose a sense of how much it really takes to do the things that we would want our military to be able to do. I think we also lose a sense of the scale of the world, how big it is, how far away distant theaters are, and what it takes, again, for military operations to be carried out in an effective way. And so what we try to do at Heritage and through the index that you mentioned, which is online and easily accessible, and this paper that we've got in the latest quarterly issue of inFOCUS, right, is that the numbers really matter. And we can do historical comparisons. What did it take to prevail in the Cold War against the Soviet Union in Europe? How much did the economy actually contribute to military power? We can do those comparisons, and they're very useful, and I think they're very insightful. But also we have to take into account, what is today's world like? And what do we anticipate tomorrow's world being like? So just in comparison, in the Cold War, we would spend roughly 5% of gross domestic product of GDP on the military. If you took 5% of GDP today on a $20 trillion economy, the average would be a $1 trillion defense budget. That would be a historical average. But today, people choke on 700 billion or 740 billion. I mean, if you were going on averages, we would actually be spending 25% more on that. So it's something that we really kind of lose a sense of relational value on. People don't understand how old our military is in terms of its equipment. The average age of a fighter aircraft in the Air Force is 30 years old. I don't know of anybody that drives a 30-year-old car, right? And yet we expect our young men and women to go to war flying high-performance aircraft that are 30 years old. Over half of the ships in the US Navy are 20 years old or older. And it's most of the big surface combatant platforms that are at that age. In 1990, let's just take a year at the end of the Cold War, the US Army had 770,000 soldiers on active duty. Today, the US Army has 480,000. So it's reduced by a third in size. When I was in the Marine Corps, we had 27 battalions, infantry battalions, amongst all the other things. The Marine Corps dropped down to 21, and they've rebuilt a bit to 24, but you're still talking about a smaller Marine Corps. And yet, by the Cold War, when you had one capital to have to worry about, Moscow, right, heart of the Soviet Union, most of your activity was in Europe. Now you have to deal with Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, Pyongyang. You have North Korea as a nuclear power. You have Iran as an aspirational nuclear power. You have China, that is the second largest economy in the world, and they are investing heavily in their military capabilities. So what we have is a small military that has very old equipment, and we're asking it to play out on a larger stage against more competitors. In the Cold War, we weren't worried about wars in the Middle East or in South Asia. We weren't worried about a lot of activities in Africa. But with terrorist organizations like ISIS, Hezbollah, the Taliban in Afghanistan, I don't know, pick any number of a dozen entities in Africa. It's just a more convoluted, complex, and threatening world. And modern technologies enable these small groups and various state actors to be much more effective than they would have been back in the 1970s and 80s. And so when the Cold War came to an end and we had the happy decade of the 1990s, our biggest concern was about Japan buying up all the real estate and companies in the western half of the US. It was about making money in Silicon Valley. And we allowed a lot of our military things to atrophy. We didn't buy any tactical airplanes from 1992 to 2000. I mean, how do you go for nearly a decade buying no new aircraft while the aircraft that you are flying are rapidly aging out of the system? And so then 9/11 happens with September 11, 2001, the terrorist attacks, and the US military establishment, much smaller, had to focus almost exclusively on counterterrorism in Afghanistan and then later on in Iraq and counterinsurgency operations. And it really lost a sense of what it meant to play big ball, right? Big conventional operations against a sizable opponent that had real capabilities. You know, the Taliban didn't have any Navy, no Air Force, no artillery capabilities, no armored formations. And so the experience of our military had to do with overwhelming capabilities against a near non-entity that had no real military sorts of things. And they think that that's what normal war is. And over 20 years, you're talking about a couple of generations of military personnel that have come and gone. So today, we have a budget that's probably 3/4 the size of what it needs to be. You have a military that's 2/3 the size and capacity of what it needs to be, and it's using equipment that's 20 or 30 years old, nearing the end of its lifespan. So now when we talk about the defense budget, we have context. You know, are we spending enough in the military to secure the country itself and certainly our interests in many different theaters? Can we be a reliable ally to partners in those theaters? You know, you want more people on your team than on your opponents. If we're worried about jobs here at home, where are the markets that we're selling the goods and services produced here in the United States? Where do we get the raw materials from? Thank goodness under the current administration, we've achieved energy independence. And so we're not nearly as reliant on oil out of the Middle East or out of the waters near Venezuela. If that weren't the case, you know, would that shape our foreign policy and what we're willing to tolerate in some of these parts of the world where you have these odious regimes, authoritarian, and they're just brutal, right? So getting energy independence has been essential to us being able to do what we needed to do in the world, but we just don't have the resources to really support and defend American interests abroad. Last kind of general comment, and I would really love to get into some discussion between us and with the audience members, is that yes, absolutely, diplomatic approaches are a much preferred option. We would much prefer to have, you know, free market capitalism and free trade between countries so that goods and services can go back and forth and everybody wins from that. You know, wealth is generated, better quality of life. But what we have found historically is that you can't have good relationships with other countries. You can't have access to markets when your security is seriously compromised. Nobody is going to line up on your team and in a kind of an alliance relationship if you don't think that you have the wherewithal to not only defend your own interests, but to help out somebody else in a time of trouble. So a very muscular, militarized, aggressive Russia or China will do what they want to do if an equally strong country isn't there to stop them, right? And to force them to play by the rules of a more even-handed game. And I think where we're at today, where it takes 3 weeks to get a military force by sea from the west coast of the United States to the South China Sea, it takes 10 days to sail across the Atlantic to reinforce a position in Europe. And you have much less capabilities US-wise in these key regions. And our historical partners have underinvested even more so. And so they have less domestic capability to address, you know, a challenger like Russia in Ukraine or up in the Baltic states or in Syria or supporting Turkey, and certainly what China is doing in the East and South China Seas. So it's a very worrisome picture to our point of view. I think it threatens everything else that you had mentioned, you know, freedom and democracy and liberalism in the true Western sense. You know, none of that is possible if your security can't be guaranteed or at least addressed in a meaningful way. And so we argue for a stronger defense budget. We could talk about how the Defense Department is spending its dollars today and where it needs to go in the future. Certainly happy to talk about the relevance of technology and whether that helps or hinders in various ways that might be not so obvious to the layperson. And I'll just give it back to you there, Shoshana, and we'll see where we go. I think you're still on mute.
I'll never get that right. I will never get that right. Okay. So I'm not going to start with a list of questions. You just said something about how technology helps or hinders. We tend to think of technology always as helping. In what sense could technology hinder our efforts?
So the technologist, very excited about the potential value of whatever that new technology is. Remote medicine, telemedicine, robots or unmanned systems that help, artificial intelligence, helping us to sort through vast amounts of data that a human being couldn't do very quickly, and give you a better sense and awareness of what's going on so that you can better use your resources, right? If you had new batteries and you can go with electrical power, you don't have to deal with a bunch of cumbersome barrels of oil, these big drums. It's moving liquids in great quantity is just a logistical nightmare. If I can have directed energy, a laser system or something like that, I don't have to worry about heavy, cumbersome conventional munitions. Very, very troublesome to kind of move around a battlefield and reload into a conventional gun. So these new technologies are just terrific in what they promise. The problem is the advocates always think that they will arrive in usable form far earlier than what is actually the case. It's always another $1 million or $10 million to solve a technical problem that they're trying to grapple with. It's always another 6 months that turns into 2 years or 10 years. And so you find that you allow your known and proven capabilities to get older and more maintenance intense, and to start reducing in capacity because you just don't have the budget to continue keeping up this aging force, while you're waiting on the promise of the new technology to become a reality, right? So I can remember as a kid watching some science fiction programs, and Space 1999, we were going to have bases on the moon, right? Hasn't happened yet. So there are always this very alluring, appealing, attractive promise of technology that eventually comes to pass, but it's always much later and at greater cost than what the technologists had promised up front. And it also doesn't come without the cost of additional people. So today we can field unmanned systems, a very small aerial unmanned system that carries a high fidelity camera or maybe even a munition on it. And an infantry squad can take one of those to the field and fly it up into the air, and it can tell you that the enemy might be on the other side of the hill, or better able to relay communications. But this is another thing that has to be managed. So do I do away with a machine gunner or a mortarman or an infantryman with a rifle to replace them with a technology expert? Or is this an additive thing? I need my infantry squad with all of its conventional capabilities, plus I need the operator and the maintainer for this new system that's been introduced to the force. So what we find is new technologies, at least in the first decade or so, are additive. They complement, they enable, they enhance, they expand the capability portfolio of the force, but they're not cost-free. They actually you need more people when they're first introduced, and they're not a replacement for the tried and proven conventional traditional capabilities that we still need to see on the battlefield. The other danger is this thought that something like cyber or a hypervelocity munition or a space-based platform can win a war for you. Well, I might have terrific cyber tools, but my malware or my offensive cyber capabilities can't control a town or a village. They can't dominate a presence in a valley. So physical ownership of key terrain, inhibiting the sailing of an enemy naval fleet through a key strait, or the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or Islamic State, hooligans coming into a town and they're beheading people. My cyber tools don't really stop that from happening. So you need a physical military capability that can push an enemy out, refuse their ownership or use of important battle space or land or air or sea, and actually enable you to use it, to your own advantage to push back their forces. So there's great promise, but there is also a danger in placing too much confidence in technology before we really know what it means on the battlefield.
Which goes a little bit to the first question, or one of the first questions that we got from a listener that says, we are inundated with articles and newspaper articles that appear to suggest that China and even Russia have surpassed us militarily in some ways. Is our current strategic planning, and you've got us understanding there's a long timeline for some of this technology, is our current strategic planning realistic given China's accelerated military spending and modernization, plus an opportunistic Russia, plus an unpredictable North Korea, plus Iran? Those guys appear to have some serious capabilities. Where do they stand vis-a-vis us?
Yeah, so the United States had an incredible opportunity following the devastation of World War II, and or even in World War II. By that I mean, in Germany and Japan, to use examples, when their industrial capability was under constant bombing, their ability to produce things were being destroyed much faster than they could rebuild a new factory. When Japan and Germany were both destroyed, that their economies were in shambles and they had no industrial capability, the United States was untouched. So we were able to just pump out all kinds of goods and services and materials and things and really achieve the dominant position. Why do I bring up that historical case? If we look at what we allowed our defense industrial base, the manufacturers of hardware like planes and tanks and ships, what we allowed to happen in the 1990s and even into the early 2000s, you see a shrinkage of that industrial capability. So if I have a smaller force, why would I want to continue buying tanks and ships and airplanes? I mean, the force isn't there to use them. And so what we saw was a lot of consolidation of various companies into a single company, and a kind of a smallness, a shrinkage of what they were able to produce in a short period of time. Meanwhile, China decides to really invest in industrial output. And so they have been building ships like no tomorrow, and they have dramatically expanded their fleet. Today, the US Navy has about 297 ships. That's one Navy that tries to operate in many different parts of the world. And so on any given day, you might have 1/3 of that Navy that is actually out sailing. So to make the math easy, let's just call it 100 ships. Of those 100 ships, you might have 60 that are dedicated to the Indo-Pacific region. So let's say 60 ships of the US Navy are actually out in the waters of the Western Pacific, Indian Ocean, that area of the world. Meanwhile, China has 350 ships already. All of their ships are in the immediate environment of China, East China Sea, South China Sea, going down toward the Indian Ocean in that area. So our 60 is now faced with competing against 350 of our major competitor. Our latest shipbuilding plan has said that we also want to get to 350, but that won't occur until the year 2035. So we have a China that in total numbers has 20% more ships than the United States. It has a 5-to-1 advantage between ships that it currently possesses in its region against the number of ships that we have in its region. And they are 15 years ahead of us in industrial capability and continuing to build out their naval capabilities, right? So, I mean, this is the reality. So if we wanted to dramatically expand our shipbuilding capability, just to use that as one example, we don't have the industrial output. How do we dramatically expand a shipbuilding facility? That has to take place first. You have to recruit and train workers who can do welding and riveting and all the other sorts of things without flaws so that the ship doesn't fail. And then you get to money to actually buy the materials that you would need to use to buy that ship. So again, it's digging yourself into a very deep hole by allowing things to atrophy over time, and the loss of the industrial capability to build a ship, to build an airplane, to build a tank, or certainly to build munitions. And if you needed to surge production capacity, you just can't do that overnight. Right now with the F-35 Lightning, which is the latest generation attack or fighter aircraft that is fielded across the Marine Corps, the Navy, and the Air Force, there is only one assembly plant in the entire United States that does final assembly of all these pieces, and it's in Fort Worth, Texas. You only have one company that can make main battle tanks, and that's in Lima, Ohio. You only have one yard that can produce aircraft carriers. So again, it's decisions that have been taken or made over a 30 or 40-year period of time, since the end of the Cold War, let's say 30 years, that have gotten us to a point where in the face of a very aggressive modernization and production effort by a country like China in particular, but certainly in some areas like Russia, that they are outpacing us. Now, the question then is, they've got more stuff. Is their stuff as good as ours? In some cases it is, but then you also have the ability to use those things. And I think it's a very credible argument to make that our operational experience still trumps that of China and Russia. You know, what we have been doing keeps your people familiar with using equipment, coordinating activities between, various forces, logistically supporting operations, very, very far from home. I mean, us being able to do stuff in the Middle East or the Western Pacific is something that really no other country can do. So industrially, they are outpacing us. Technologically, perhaps even, since science is science, and they've been stealing, our science and intellectual property for 20 plus years, but the ability to use it effectively is still a ball that's in our court. Now, China knows that, and you see them making dramatic investments in exercises and training and getting much better. Russia has been getting experience in Syria. They've been getting experience in Ukraine, and certainly with their operational deployments and exercises in northeastern, northwestern Russia, and up into the Barents Sea, the Arctic Ocean, and down into the northern European climes. So there are kind of wins on both sides of that, but it is certainly something that should be informing our political debate.
So you said something else in the middle of that answer about China stealing from us, and everybody knows that China steals. We're all aware that China steals. The Pentagon has made a big push for us to understand that they understand that China steals. How are we doing at least in the defense sphere, cutting the Chinese off? Are we making strides? Are they still stealing?
Yeah,
are we still buying from them?
Yeah,
are we still,
I would say it's a mixed record. Awareness is a big step, right? First, you have to recognize there's a problem, and then you have to decide to do something about the problem. So the recognition in the Defense Department is there. The recognition is not there on the civilian side. So these modern technologies that we've alluded to or talked about a bit, most of that development is in the civilian sector. 5G technologies, unmanned robotics sorts of systems. I mean, these cutting edge things are actually developed in the civilian world, in the commercial world. Well, if you're a company developing latest generation computers, you want to sell to a global market. If I can design a computer with a very fast processor, unlike in the Cold War, where I could say that a particular piece of equipment had national security value and you can't export this, how do you apply that same kind of rule against the intellectual understanding, the scientific knowledge of artificial intelligence, and of advanced material sciences and those sorts of things? So to the extent that we have tens of thousands of Chinese students attending top-level American universities and studying in the classrooms of Nobel laureates and our academic brilliant minds that are really at the cutting edge of these sorts of things, they take that knowledge and they bring it right back to China. They burrow in as employees, or the Chinese use cyber intrusion techniques to steal intellectual property. And so whereas the US military will spend billions of dollars on research and development, all of those costs, right, are borne by the American taxpayer to develop the cutting edge fighter. The Chinese, by stealing that, save all that money. They just take it then and build the end product. And so they're able to build somewhat equivalent types of capabilities for far less expense because we have fronted all of that R&D effort. And so there has to be understanding on the civilian commercial side commensurate with national security interests, and a more of a collaborative approach between the government and the commercial sector to decide that there really are teams that you have to choose to be on. Our view at the Heritage Foundation, certainly my view personally, is if you are a company based in the United States and you get all the benefits of legal protections, access to academia, a stable political environment, all those good things that allow you to be a global heavyweight in your particular industry, you should really be making a choice about the extent to which you want to do business with a regime like the Communist Party in Beijing. And at least to this point, there isn't enough social pressure that have been brought to bear to these companies to force them to decide if there are teams, and if there are teams, which obviously there are, which team do you want to be on? And you might have to forego access to a billion-person Chinese market, which is the allure to many Western countries. In fact, Germany, a very strong, close NATO ally, its largest trading partner is China. Germany has made itself dependent on energy coming out of Russia. So when we come to them and we say Nord Stream 2 pipeline is a bad idea, and we say that Chinese, Huawei developed 5G technologies are a bad idea, it is not an easy decision for them to make because their economy is so reliant on these economic relationships with Russia and China. This sort of discussion and this awareness needs to happen in the United States. And I think a lot of social pressure needs to be brought to bear against elected officials and corporate executives so that they make better informed decisions that are inherently in the long-term interest of the US.
So sort of like Mark Cuban saying that it was okay to do business in China because it's worth $500 million to the NBA. Never mind. Okay, question from a listener. We used to have a mantra in the United States that said that the United States needed to be prepared for 2 major regional contingencies, the assumption being one in the Pacific, one in the Middle East. Can we still do that? First of all, could we ever do it? Secondly, can we do it now?
Yeah, I think arguably we could because the construct was different. In the Cold War, it was the Soviet Union. So Soviet Navy forces were in different parts of the world, US Navy forces were in different parts of the world. And we had good allies that had capable navies. Today, the British Royal Navy has 17 surface combatants in the entire Navy. The entire British military establishment, Royal Navy, Royal Air Force, British Army, and the Royal Marines, the totality of that is smaller than the United States Marine Corps. I think there are 160,000 or so. The US Marine Corps is 186,000. So it tells you that the size and capacity for things is much less today than it was in the past. In the past, again, you can be in different theaters, and what you did in one part of the world resonated back in Moscow and affected operations in a different part of the world. Today, though, when you've got dealing like what we mentioned with Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China, our military has to compete with the totality of those 4 different entities. And so we've done the historical research about what it took in Korea, Vietnam, Operation Desert Storm in 1991, and Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, how much US Army was needed to fight one of those larger conventional wars. If you wanted to have the capacity to handle 2 and had a little bit of buffer because some of your force is not always ready, it's in training or it's in movement or transition or something else going on, we postulate that you would need a US Army of about 50 combat brigades in the active component. The Army is something like, I think it's 31. So they are much smaller. They have the ability, the totality of the US military across the Navy, Army, Air Force, and Marine Corps has the ability to engage in one major regional conflict and probably win that. But it doesn't have much left over. It would take everything that we've got to fight a war in one theater. So you can see the opportunistic exploitation potential here, where China decides to do something vis-a-vis Taiwan, or Russia decides to go into the Baltic states or do something where you need a large military response to, if nothing else, halt them or deter them. The other actor then could see that opportunity and make their own move in a way that the US would not be able to respond to. So that's the situation we have gotten into, where we have a very small military relative to global interests and responsibilities. We can handle one major contingency, and that would be about it.
So there's a follow-up question from a listener having to do with burden sharing. But you've just put your finger on the problem with some of our best allies and our closest friends. Can we actually do burden sharing, is the question, with allies who often preside over small, under-resourced militaries? And secondly to that, in the same question, are recent talks among the US, Australia, and a few other Asian Pacific friends about deterring an expansionist China likely to lead to a bloc that is what we would consider an anti-Chinese bloc?
Yeah, more of a coalition of the willing, I think, if you want to use that phrase. I don't think you'll see a formal arrangement like a NATO, because in Asia, these countries have a lot of historical enmity, their own issues between Japan and South Korea, for example. Countries that want to kind of go their own way, Vietnam, right, has got some issues. India has always wanted to be a major independent player. So if there is a silver lining on the cloud of an aggressive authoritarian regime, it's when it does start moving like China did in Hong Kong, it forces people to wake up, that this is not just some quiet country that seeks, economic gain. They actually have their own agenda. And so you can no longer stay on the sidelines. If you're Malaysia, the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, there is this big bully in the region, in the neighborhood, that's China. And so it wakes people up. The awakening, again, is a good thing, but it takes a while then to change your military posture. About a year ago or so, Germany, for example, had no deployable submarines. Its flight hour program for its pilots was so poorly funded that the German Air Force had to contract with civilian helicopter companies so that the military helicopter pilots renting a civilian helicopter could get enough flight hours to maintain some level of proficiency. Italy has very minimal military capability. Spain has almost none. So it seems that the countries that are closest to a particular zone of conflict are much more serious. Eastern European countries, much more serious about the threat posed by Russia than countries that are further away like Spain or Portugal, right? Japan was very inward, defense looking. It's now had to look outward and decide if China becomes a real problem, which it is, what is Japan going to do about that, right? And so this awakening is changing some domestic attitudes, but they have a long road to go before they have exportable, usable military power. So a good friend of mine, Andrew Mikta, who's at the George C. Marshall Center, has really written about not burden sharing, but burden transferring. So are there things that our friends in key regions can do on their own that would allow the United States to redirect resources that only it can provide to the most worrisome theater? Are there things, let's say in the Baltic states, they live in the neighborhood, there's high fidelity intelligence, there's awareness, there are relationships that exist between, let's say, Lithuania and Belarus and Russia that don't exist between the United States and Belarus or Russia. So are there different sorts of contributions that local players can make that offset their lack of conventional military power and would actually enhance the effectiveness of US military power? So I think it's that kind of conversation that needs to take place, and it is likely to occur more aggressively in the next year or two.
Great. So now we have a two-part question. One financial question and one a trend line question. Under George W. Bush, the way he framed it was that we were fighting war against terrorists and the states that harbor and support them. And that was low intensity, and that was counterinsurgency and those sorts of things. Did that ruin our ability to do bigger and other things? That's the trendline question on the ground. Trendline, financially, we had sequestration under the Obama administration, enormous cuts in our budget. How are we doing under the Trump administration? Trendline better, trendline worse?
Yeah, so to the second question, much better. If you remember when he came into office, and at that time it was Secretary of Defense Mattis, the alarm bells were ringing on current readiness. So I want to have a more modern, better force in the future, but I have to ensure that the force I have today is at least ready for combat. So over the last 3 years, significant advances have been made in restoring current readiness, combat readiness to the current force, and the reduction of maintenance backlog. So a ship might wait for 2 years to get into the yards to fix problems. Those problems are worsening, while it's waiting to get into the shipyard. But a lot of that stuff, not all of it, but a lot of that stuff has been reduced. Combat readiness is much better than what it was 3 years ago. The challenge now is I've got a better ready small force that still has old equipment. So do my modernization accounts. Am I buying sufficient new stuff in sufficient quantity that the military can expand its capability set and actually be able to sustain operations over time? So how this relates to the first question on that was, yes, it was harmful in this global war on terrorism in the sense that it was also unavoidable. So if we were to conduct operations against terrorist organizations, which we really had to do at that time, you remember the mood in 2002, 2003, you only have so much military power. And so it would have been irresponsible of the military to say, we're only going to use 50% of our capability to hunt down terrorists in Afghanistan because we want to preserve military power, even though we don't have another major state competitor out there, right? They had to go all in. So to do what they did as effectively as they did in hunting down terrorists of all sorts, they had to use all of the capabilities that they owned. So your personnel get used to this idea that I've got overhead air cover 24/7 with no threat. A pilot could fly at 20,000 feet without any fear of being shot down. Nobody interdicted the movement of logistical supplies by sea. What is Islamic State or an insurgent group in Iraq or the Taliban in Afghanistan going to do about a supply ship leaving the port of San Diego? So we got used to conducting operations in a certain way with very low, almost non-existent attrition, no threat to supply lines in the strategic operational sense. But you had to do that to fight those fights. As the world has changed, we have a military establishment that has to relearn things that it knew very well 30 years ago. But all of that experience is gone. And even the combat experience that our young men and women had in the days of Afghanistan and Iraq, I do my tour of enlistment for 4 or 8 years in the Marine Corps or the Army. I leave, somebody new coming in doesn't have that same experience. So we're on a very steep learning curve to relearn things that the military was very good at in dealing with peer level competitors, military operations on a very large scale. And so that's where we have to relearn these sorts of things. Current tactical readiness has been improved. We still don't have the capacity or the recent historical experience to engage in modern, high-intensity, large-scale conventional warfare where attrition and combat losses would be a feature.
So we did it, and we did it well. And 18 years later, we're still in Afghanistan. We're still doing it. Do you see us getting out? I know the president would like to get out. Do you see us getting out?
Yes, I do. And we, myself and Tom Spores, the director of our center, have really kind of been jaded with this idea of forever wars. I mean, they really aren't. If you look at the numbers of people who are on the ground, just a very, very small percentage of what used to be there. In Afghanistan, we had 100,000 personnel. Today, we've got fewer than 10,000, 8,000 or 9,000. And those are in a training and advisory capacity. We've got a few hundred in Syria. We've got just a few thousand in Iraq to support the Iraqi military. And we've maintained force presence in many countries around the world so that, one, you know what's going on. Two, you're able to influence or to shape events, right? Three, you're deterring or keeping kind of minimize the bad behavior of whoever it is that's causing problems in those regions. So it's just an investment in security. We've got insurance on our automobiles and our homes in the event that something bad happens, and it minimizes the cost or improves response time to recover from that. So these are small allocations of the totality of US military power. But conditions change over time. So the reason we went into Afghanistan in the first place was to hunt down Al-Qaeda. You couldn't get to Al-Qaeda because the Taliban was in the way, so you had to remove them. 19 years later, conditions have changed. You know, what is the nature of Afghanistan? Does it serve as a potential breeding ground? Are there contests being played out between Iran, China, and Russia for influence in this region? If you want to know what's going on and be a voice in those sorts of activities and hopefully shape things to our interest, because keep in mind, Afghanistan borders Pakistan, politically unstable, a nuclear power. It abuts India, and there are problems between Pakistan and India, both of which are nuclear powers. You know, there are contested border disputes between India and China. So you can see it's a turmoil, right, prone region. And if you're not involved in the region in some way, then you really have no control or ability to influence events that might come back and harm you at a much larger scale. So these are small investments and US capability for larger strategic interests. I think at some point we'll reduce even further in Afghanistan. Hopefully Iraq gets its act together, we'll have to see. Certainly Syria is a basket case, and we're always mindful of the impact that that might have on the state of Israel. So we will remain involved to the extent that US interests require involvement, but today, as opposed to 15 years ago or more, it's a very small percentage.
So we had a couple of listeners who are appalled at the thought of American business choosing to do business with China as opposed to staying close to home. So I just thought you'd like to know that we have now alerted some of our listeners to the fact that this is a problem.
Look at Chinese influence in Hollywood, you know, approving scripts and how characters are revealed. The NBA, the Basketball Association, you know, worried about harming its economic interests in China with its billion-person market. So we need a lot of social pressure that calls these companies into account.
I think you've encouraged a couple of our people today to go off in that direction. So as we're coming to an end here, I have a question about us. We have a very divided American body politic today. So the first part, it's a multi-part question. The first part is, do you think there is a consensus to support the cost of personnel, material, and social burdens of facing a country like China? Just the first part of the question. Second part of the question is, the all-volunteer force has given us a very well-trained, motivated, capable force, maybe the best force we've ever had in terms of personnel. But can we afford it for the future? Because it's a very expensive force. And the last bit of the question is, given how war is changing, you've talked about technologies, do we need a very large force? Can we roll this over into a smaller force, whether it's a volunteer force or a draft force? Any interest in bringing back the draft?
Short answer, no. So we're talking about, you know, consensus, affordability, and largeness, right? Mm-hmm. I would say that on consensus, Americans come together when a danger becomes very clear. We've had nearly 30 years of extended peace and prosperity relative to existential threats. And so extended periods breed complacency and a lot of stupidity, you know, just stupid commentary. You know, you can get completely wrapped up in your own self-interest, in this identity politics nonsense, eco-religions, you know, all those sorts of things, because there isn't a wolf, you know, clawing at your door, right? And so the nature of competition to date has been much more economic. It's been very subtle. Hybrid warfare, gray zone, influence operations, disinformation campaigns. And it's hard to really put your finger on something like that. These are not tanks arrayed on the inter-German border between Warsaw Pact countries and NATO countries, you know. But as these things become much more physical, more manifest in a militarized sense, which we're seeing. If North Korea does a test launch of its big new ICBM, that's an issue. If Iran decides to get much more militaristic in what it's doing in the Persian Gulf and relative to the Arab countries in the Middle East, it becomes more real. And so I think when challenges or dangers become real, like the towers in New York City being felled by a terror group, it's amazing how quickly Americans do come together. What that always means is that the time needed to respond and the cost of response is far greater than would have been the case otherwise. But it's just human nature that until you can actually point to a danger that I really understand, I am more inclined to do things that I want to do rather than discipline myself to do the things that I really should be doing. So the good thing about America is this freedom, the ability to choose our own course, to do things that we would want to do. The downside to that is you've got a mix of opinions and the freedom to pursue those opinions, which creates a very complicated domestic situation. But when danger threatens, I think our history shows that Americans come together. In terms of affordability, over the last half century, if we went back to 1970 as an example, the cost of manpower to outfit the average soldier has increased 16-fold, 1-6. So that's 16 times the rate of inflation. So if we want to recruit really capable young Americans and provide them a quality of life and expert training, you've got to compete with the civilian world for that. Right now, 72% of American youth, because of criminal records, substance abuse, obesity, and other health issues, are ineligible for military service, even if they wanted to. So of the other 28%, now how many of those kids are willing to and want to serve? And so you are competing with civilian industry and the IT sector and social media and everybody else for a fairly small percentage of American youth. And so you have to have a pay and benefits package, that one, makes it nice to want to join. And then if you want to be effective on a very modern battlefield, you were talking about all the advanced technologies, you have to have people trained and able to use that stuff. And so that training, maintenance, utilization of those kinds of services really calls upon an exceptional person. And again, it just costs to do that. In terms of largeness or size, if our tech is roughly equaled by our competitors' tech, if it's cyber, space-based systems, unmanned systems and all that, it could very well be that the high technology, the digital part, neutralizes each other. And so what you have left over is the more analog, old school, physical, conventional military capabilities, and now numbers really do matter. If I lose a tank in battle and I only had 10 tanks because I was relying on all these new unmanned systems, I've lost 10% of my ground combat capability. And so in warfare, numbers, especially in the face of physical attrition, really are a decisive component. So yes, I think we need a military that is large enough to service and defend US interests that play out on a global stage.
So leave us, because we have to leave. We're coming to the end of our program. And I want to thank you for a terrific presentation and lots of great answers to questions. But I'm not sure how I feel, because I like to end every program on a positive note. You've been really depressing in some ways, but you've been optimistic in other ways. So if I had to ask you to balance the scales for me, can we do it? Can the United States meet the challenge that sits in front of us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think these are fundamental advantages, right? And it's the very philosophical argument in some ways. What is the goodness of Western liberal democracy and capitalism versus a repressive, authoritarian, autocratic regime? I mean, the seeds of that regime's destruction are woven into the very nature of the regime. Can China actually expand to be a world power as a surveillance state when other countries see the impact of that? You can't imprison 1 million Uyghurs, right, and expect that other countries like England or France or the United States are going to tolerate that kind of thing becoming the global norm, right? So there is something about our way of life that I think will always trump these evil, repressive, destructive regimes. And then you just have the spirit of America. And I know we get all wrangled up with the current political discord, which is horrific, what we're seeing play out in the streets of major American cities and all the nonsense going on Capitol Hill now. But at the heart of it, we've got talented, intelligent, values-oriented people who usually want to do the right thing for the right reasons. And so when we do bring in young Americans into the military, the team building that occurs is extraordinary. We've got bright, young, again, values-centered, Western cultured Americans that are going out to do the nation's bidding, and they always shine. I mean, you got occasional problems here and there, but where don't you have that? You know, in business and church and families and sports teams and everything else. But by and large, Americans are awesome, and they always pick up the slack and they do the job that nobody else wants to do, and we reap the rewards of that. So I am always optimistic for the future. I just wish it wasn't as painful as it needs to be, you know, or needn't be, to get to that ultimate win.
I think that's a great answer. That is a great place to leave us. Again, thank you, Dakota Wood. Ladies and gentlemen, the last issue of inFOCUS magazine, fall 2020, has a wonderful article by Dakota Wood and some of his colleagues from the Heritage Foundation. So I encourage you to go to our website and read it. Dakota, thank you. Everyone else, look for your next invitation.